The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to thank you for joining us for our first ever Meaningful Voices Book Club. We're delighted that you're joining us today. Because this is our first book club, there is a little bit of experimentation going on, so we would also love your feedback. At the end of tonight's discussion, you'll be prompted to fill out a brief survey, and if you would please take a moment and tell us what you thought, we would really appreciate it. You should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen that should be coming up right now. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your headset or speakers are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. And if you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the program and then return to the link in your email and try to reconnect again. That should help. All the audience members are muted, which is a problem with this platform, but we do want to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me anytime using the question feature on the right side of your screen. And you can just send me your questions, comments, and as the conversation goes on, I will speak for you because unfortunately the software doesn't let us have you speak for yourselves. So I apologize for that. If you don't see the question box, click on the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, and that will open up more features for you to use. So please send me your questions and comments at any time. We are delighted to have three people joining us today. Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune is the founder and senior analyst at Faith Trust Institute. Dr. Meredith Minister is Associate Professor of Religion at Shenandoah University, and Dr. Denise Starkey is Associate Professor and Chair of Theology and Religious Studies and the Director of Women and Gender Studies program at the College of St. Scholastica. So I am going to turn this over to our experts, but please remember that you can send your questions anytime. And let's see.
Okay.
I'm trying to make the webinar, the webcam show up. Sorry, folks. This will just, again, experiment.
Well, I see everybody.
I'm not sure that our audience is seeing them.
Okay.
No. Okay, so start the conversation, and I will try to fix this, okay?
Okay, no problem. So good evening. This is Marie Fortune, and welcome to our first session of the Meaningful Voices Book Club. Here at Faith Trust, we want to use the book club format to provide opportunity for discussion of significant authors whose work intersects with our commitment to address sexual and domestic violence. Sarah, you need to be muted if you're not. Thank you. And in doing this, we always will be asking the questions of how faith and religion play a role in our understanding so that we can mobilize our resources to change the aspects of our cultures that continue to cause harm to others. So our first book in the Meaningful Voices Book Club is Missoula. And I think we would probably agree that this book was very hard to read. It deals with some very difficult material. And so we just want to alert you to that in terms of you being able to be aware and take care of yourselves. We know how emotionally challenging reading Missoula is for many people, and we know this discussion may be difficult. It's possible that in reading sections from the book, we may be using explicit language as we quote from the text. And so we just want you to be aware of that and know that your well-being is our first priority. If you need to take care of yourself, feel free to exit the discussion, but there will be a recording available on our archive website if you want to return to it at a later time. So Missoula is a book that peels back the layers of a particular university and a particular community to examine the epidemic of sexual assault on campuses. The author, Jon Krakauer, could have written about a lot of other university towns or cities with high-profile athletic programs. This is because the report he gives is not unusual or particular. It is sadly generic. But because Krakauer goes deep into the weeds to provide us with a detailed account of the victims and perpetrators at the University of Montana, of the various powers that be, and of the community of Missoula in which they all live together, he provides a window into how rape culture works, how families, friends, and institutions protect rapists, how communities disparage victims and survivors, and subsequently how many people get away with rape and continue to assault others. We will approach this discussion not as a book review, but as an opportunity to use this book to share a discussion of a very complex set of circumstances. Undergraduates, alcohol, football, sexuality, law enforcement, and university administration. What could possibly go wrong? In fact, today, literally, new data was released from the Department of Justice reporting on an anonymous survey of students at 9 universities last year about their experiences of sexual assault. And the link to that is at the end on our resource list, but just to give you the summary of the report, they found that, in fact, 1 in 4 women on these 9 college campuses experienced a completed sexual assault while at college, and that survivors were highly unlikely to report these experiences to anyone in authority. After reading the book Missoula, we know why that is the case. So that's what we're here to talk about, and I'm delighted to be joined by 2 colleagues, and I've asked them each to introduce themselves to say a little bit more about the work that they do in their own context, so you'll kind of know where they're coming from. Denise, would you begin?
Sure. I'd like to start. Can you hear me? By just making sure you can hear me.
Yep.
Okay. And start by saying thanks to Marie and Sarah and Faith Trust for what I think is a really profound idea of a book club and this discussion, and I'm glad to be part of it. I'm a feminist theologian, and my area of research as a theologian and scholar is violence against women and children, and particularly looking at the way that theological doctrines function to sometimes maintain or inhibit healing. I deliberately chose to come to a college where we have a very large population of first-generation college students. Many of them come from what we call in Minnesota the Iron Range, and so there's a great deal of domestic violence that happens that's very tied to the economy of what's happening in the steel industry and its ups and downs. A lot of first-generation college students who come to school, and the only thing that they know about this topic are the negative understandings of feminism that they've taken in from the media or from their very small, typically isolated context. And I teach, what I do in my teaching, and I think about teaching as a way of organizing and doing some of the consciousness raising that was the classic hallmark of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. And I do that because I find that a lot of students, this is brand new to them. So even though we've been talking about rape culture for 40 years, it's concept that has not been talked about or discussed in the open. I find that students often don't have the skills, they don't have the basic understanding of what rape culture is, of all of these dynamics that go into feeding it, and many of which we're going to talk about tonight. And then they don't have a larger context for understanding where this comes from. And so I feel like that's part of my job as someone who's in the classroom working with traditional age and first-generation college students, is to help them understand that this hasn't always been there from the very beginning, that it was created. And if it was created, it can be changed. And they have a role to play in that. I think the other thing I would say is that a lot of the students that come into our classrooms increasingly are survivors. And they come into a college campus, and one of the disturbing things, at least on my campus, and I don't think it's unusual, is that they enter dorm culture, which is often a party culture, but they also they enter this dualistic culture where this phenomenon that we've talked about in feminist theology and feminism for a long time of the Madonna whore dilemma is one that still plays out. So either they participate and they are sexually active and experience being shamed for that, which we typically call slut shaming, or if they don't participate, then they are actually labeled in other ways. So they come into this vortex, which is often a no-win situation, and where they get into situations where it's not their fault, but the dominant narrative is one that tells them this is how you have to behave, and when they follow along with that dominant narrative, or they're the victim of that dominant narrative, there's not the kind of support that you would hope that they would experience. And so I think that's why Missoula does a really good job of spelling this out, using data and using the personal stories and narratives of the women that Jon Krakauer interviews. So I could go on for an hour talking about this, but I will pass it on to Meredith.
Okay, Meredith, please.
Yeah, and I was excited to hear your introduction. Just several things that you said sort of rang bells for me. Things like teaching is organizing, and this idea that our students are survivors. I often, talk about the number of students that we have in our classes, and then try to break down how many students in our classes are survivors of recent sexual assault, because we know that for 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men, we think. So using those numbers, our classrooms, all of our classrooms, most likely have survivors of recent sexual assault, and I think that that's a really important point to keep in mind whenever we're entering a classroom, no matter what that classroom is, whether it's a women's and gender studies classroom, a religion classroom, a chemistry classroom, a business classroom. I could go on. So thank you. I will introduce myself. I'm Meredith Minister. And I teach religion and women's and gender studies at Shenandoah University. My most recent work has focused on the intersection of sexual violence, U.S. Protestantism, Christian theology, and the college classroom. And so thinking about how these forces sort of come together in the college context. One of the focuses of my recent work is in thinking about how the solutions tend to be generated predominantly from student services and administrators, and I think that this sort of generation of solutions leaves faculty comfortably thinking that we don't really have much responsibility in the problem of sexual violence on college campuses or in the solutions. And so as an alternative to this sort of evasion of responsibility, I've begun intentionally integrating teaching about sexual violence into all of my introductory freshman level 101 courses, not just my women's and gender studies courses, but I'm intentionally dealing with sexual violence in all of my 101 courses. I've developed parameters for helping other faculty think about how to teach about sexual violence across the curriculum. And this fall, I led a workshop on how to integrate teaching about sexual violence into classes across the curriculum, because I think that it's really important that if we're going to deal with this problem, that we recognize that it's not something that is going to have quick solutions, but that we're dealing with a cultural problem. We're dealing with a problem in education, and I think we'll get to that a little more whenever we talk about sex education in particular. But we're talking about a problem with education. So this is something that faculty across the board need to be dealing with. So it's a little bit of, yeah.
Yeah, and we want to hear more about the results of, for both of you, your teaching experiences as we go along. Yeah, if 1 in 3 females and 1 in 7 males were sexually abused before they're 18, coming into an undergraduate situation as traditional students, and then within that setting, these new statistics of 1 in 4 for women, it seems to me like I'm back to the the question that I think the church should be dealing with as well is how can we not be addressing these issues given how common they are, certainly in women's lives, but in other people's lives as well. So, so we want to get into how Krakauer kind of opens this discussion up, and we basically are going to use an outline of 3 themes for the discussion for those of you who are with us. So can we go to the themes slide? Thank you. We're going to talk about perceptions and responses to the experiences of sexual assault as we heard them in the book, expressed by victims and survivors, by perpetrators, which I found particularly interesting how much actual data we get from perpetrators in this book, talking about how they see their behavior and their experience of it. But also the way in which law enforcement interacted with all of the various players and the university administration. So we're going to start with kind of everybody's views of what was going on when and how that then affected the way in which things were handled. But we want to get to also discussions about sexuality and rape culture, and particularly perceptions of, again, the behavior of the individuals involved and the differences between men's perceptions and women's perceptions. And then within the context of cultural change, the issues of consent and understanding consent and education around consent and so forth. But finally, we want to conclude with looking at interventions and accountability, and part of the core, I think, of Missoula is really lifting up the campus disciplinary procedures and the criminal justice system and the inadequacies of both, but also the ways in which they interacted in the cases that are reported here. And again, what this does is it just kind of gives us a picture to then consider and learn from in terms of how these things happen in many other places. So that'll be our thematic outline, just so those of you who've joined us kind of have a sense of where we're going to go. And again, please, at any point, bring your comments or questions or thoughts into the discussion, because we'd much prefer this to be a room filled with whatever it is, 20 of us having a conversation, but this is the best we can do tonight. So let's start with the question of perceptions and responses. And Meredith, as you and I talked, you had some particular observations about that. Do you want to get us started on that?
Sure. I think one of the things that really struck me whenever I was reading through this book, again, this time, were the different kinds of responses from different parties. So things like the victim survivor responses, the third party responses, the perpetrator responses, and the police responses. So I have a lot to say about all of those things, but maybe I'll just sort of start us out with some pertinent information maybe about the police responses, and then you all can jump into other places. But one of the things that I found really interesting and of course not unique in Missoula was how the chief of police was really was misinterpreting the law and misstating facts about the rate of false reporting. So, for example, I'm looking at page 42, where the chief has that misinterpretation of the law, where he's talking about how physical incapacitation differs from incapacitation of the mind, and he sort of uses this interpretation to suggest that Belknap, who was one of the victim survivors described in the book, was that her case was not prosecutable. So that was one place where he was sort of, and if you read through the paragraph there, you can see that the relevant law doesn't really make the distinction that he's making between physical incapacitation and incapacitation of the mind. And the other place where he sort of misstates facts, I think, is on page 103, and that's the where he says that the rate of false rape claims is around 50%, which is false. So there are a couple of places there that you know, we hear a lot about police responses and what happens whenever survivors go to the police, but I just thought that those two instances, not only of like the police not taking the victim seriously, but really intentionally misrepresenting the law and misstating facts, were a couple of really compelling examples of the failure of the police. So that's just one level of response. I think that there are a lot of other responses, but maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Well, one of the ones that struck me was on page 292, the whole notion about believability, the question of believability, and the speaker points out that rape is the only crime in which the victim is presumed to be lying in the beginning. If a person is mugged in an alley, would we be skeptical of the victim's testimony because there weren't any eyewitnesses? This echoes back to Hebrew scripture and the expectations of how rape was addressed even there. But I think that I was really intrigued by the believability issue and the question of how police are trained to investigate. And this is actually new information to me. At page 102, 103, the whole notion that police are trained to, let's see, it says, one of the key messages in the training video is how important it is for you as a cop to always believe the victim until every witness has been interviewed and all the available evidence has been gathered, and only then make a determination as to whether or not she's telling the truth. In most crimes, that's what cops do, but in sexual assault cases, too many cops don't take that approach. And so I didn't know that's how they were trained. I mean, that's like, okay, that makes sense. It's back to your point, Meredith, about what, you know, what's the real basis of the law around those issues. But this notion of should we believe the victim as a starting point and work from there, and then they put it up against, at several places, the presumption of innocence, which I really appreciated in the legal discussion. One of the speakers pointed out the presumption of innocence is not about a constitutional right, but rather a right based on the process of the trial. And again, we're not lawyers, and I'm sure we don't fully appreciate the difference, but I think even as lay people, we can understand that when the presumption of innocence is put forth as assume that the person is innocent regardless of the evidence and regardless of the testimony of a person who's been victimized, then we're missing the point of the principle of the process in the trial. So I was quite intrigued by the way that those things were getting framed in the criminal justice process. But what about how the victims and perpetrators were framing the issues and their perceptions? Denise, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do, and I think it's connected to what both of you have said, which is that it seems to me, even in this protect the rights of the accused, that it sets up a dualistic thing. So either one person's telling the truth and the other person's lying, and so it seems like they come into the analysis and investigation of it with this mistaken notion that they have to, someone's got to be lying and somebody's got to be telling the truth. which seems to me to be something that then unconsciously, most likely, taps into gender biases. And I think the report actually that we have listed here today that came out from the Bureau of Justice Statistics makes some really interesting points about how unidentified gender bias actually has a great impact on who you listen to, who you find to be credible, who you unwittingly feel that you're responsible for defending. And it struck me again and again when I was reading this book of what happens in my classroom, which is that often if we start talking about men, and we start talking about some of the behavior that we're talking about in this book in rape culture and in sexual and domestic violence, women are so socialized to take care of people that they immediately jump to the defense of the guys. And if there's one or two men in the class, it changes the entire dynamic of the class because all of the women jump in, say, stop picking on the guys. And they won't, and they don't know how to actually make the alternative jump in, which is advocate for themselves and actually, their own believability, their own credibility, and their right to be heard.
And for each other.
Exactly.
Think that's the other part of it. And that's one of the things that actually was interesting in the book to see how the friends of the women whose stories we have either supported them or didn't support them. To see how the women on the law enforcement side and on the university side interacted out of their experiences, and sometimes in very destructive ways and other times in very helpful ways. So it's I think it's a very important issue that you're raising, and what's the socially constructed response of always, protecting men from their behavior, which certainly was a consistent theme all across the board here.
I actually think it's a consistent theme across culture. I mean, if you just sit down and read literature or you watch media through this lens, then it's the stereotypical boys will be boys, but everything is oriented to them as the subject and protecting them. And so it makes me, there's so many different instances of this being connected to sports. So in Steubenville, the young woman who was drunk and who was gang raped, and then it was videotaped or sent by social media, and the people who reported it on behalf of the young woman were threatened because of the way that it impacted the football team. So there's this way in which we can tell what society somehow or another prefers in terms of value, and that's protect the football team, protect the football players over protect the women.
And what do you want to, go ahead, Meredith.
I was just going to say, there are moments, I agree that that's the dominant cultural narrative. There are moments in the book, so I'm looking at page 34, where Kelsey, one of the victim survivors, is willing to talk about being raped by members of the Grizz football team, and this is a quote, in the hope that doing so might keep others from being subjected to what she had been forced to endure. And so I think whenever we see victims reporting that is a sort of example of care for one another, and it doesn't always work like that. But there's a few moments in the book where that kind of response does bubble up. But I do think that it's a response that is a brave and challenging response because it's so different from the response of people like oh gosh, I'm going to lose. There are so many names. I appreciate the list of names.
It's very hard.
in the back of this book, but let's see. So contrast to the response of like Fairmont, who her sympathy, vanishes, and she's talking about how she doesn't want to get anyone in trouble. So that's from the same story, but you see those sort of different responses that sort of care for other potential victims as opposed to care for masculine entitlement to women's bodies.
Yeah, and even I think fairly consistently for the victim survivors that we hear from, that there is that concern for this not happening to somebody else, that finally motivates him to come forward. And so, yeah, we've heard that for years from victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. The point at which someone else's well-being is at stake, that they were willing and able to come forward, which I think, again, they know what's ahead and they're still willing to do that. The other place that the community gets named in this perception is on 172, and this was after Bo Donaldson had confessed to raping Huguet. Even after the media announced that Donaldson had confessed to raping Huguet and had pleaded guilty, many Missoulans continued to believe that she was lying and he was innocent. And so the whole, it's not just the individual players involved, but the whole community's response, at least as it was reported here, turned on her, even though he confessed and was convicted finally and was sent to prison. And
it's
I just
her
find
fault,
that,
according to the community. Yeah.
Right. And your point, to your point, Denise, in terms of the impact then on football in the community, but I still, find that so extraordinary that, and I've seen churches do this too, where there's been a perpetrator in the congregation who's convicted of sexual abuse and goes to prison. And there was one congregation I remember where it was the pastor, and when he got out of prison, they wanted him back because they still didn't believe that he had done it, even though he had confessed and the whole 9 yards. It's beyond my comprehension. I really don't get that whole thing.
It really reveals an amazing disconnect, because for those of us who know a little bit about how the criminal justice system works with sexual violence, the rate of conviction is so low that when someone is convicted, using the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, it's amazing then that is still not believable in a lot of communities.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience, which is, what helps us stand in solidarity with survivors when they share their stories, and what tempts us to refuse?
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
I think what happens with that, and this is interesting in historical context of the early days of the anti-rape movement, that one of our agenda items as a priority at that point was to try to get more women on rape juries, because the theory was that rape juries traditionally were all men and they never convicted other men of rape and so forth. And we could just get women on juries because, we would, of course, bring a different perspective and, be more likely to hear the evidence in terms of a conviction and so forth. What they found was that, in fact, the opposite was true. And again, this is sort of one of those painful realities, but I think what goes on with that, and I think it's part of what we see here for women, the gender specificity of this is that we look at, when we're in that position and we look at someone who's come forward and said that they were assaulted, our own self-defense mechanism kicks in to say, what is it about her that's different from me? Because if I can figure that out, then I'm safer somehow. My security is more in place, because I can say, well, she went to this bar, or she was hitchhiking, or she was whatever. It doesn't matter, whatever she was doing. I would not do that. Therefore, I am safe. Or my race, my economic status, where I live in the community, whatever it is, she's other. And we make her other so that we don't have to deal with what in fact has happened to her. And I think it's absolutely critical that as women that we really challenge each other. We have got to come at it exactly the opposite. We've got to be willing to say, this happened to her, it might not have happened to me yet, but it could have been me, therefore I need to stand with her because of all that surrounds this. But I think that's a real challenge, whether it's in the classroom or in the church or wherever we're working, to press that issue, because I understand why women, basically distance themselves and say, I can't see myself in her shoes. What do y'all think?
Well,
I think that's a hugely important point, that people think that suffering is contagious, and so they don't want to have anything to do with the person who's suffering because it might be contagious. So if you could be hurt and harmed, I could be hurt and harmed. But I think another piece of this, which is fairly large on a systemic issue, and you can see this in religion, and I think you can see it in most cultural institutions like higher education and the legal system, is this notion that the legal system was written by men from a male perspective of what is normal and normative. And so we have some fairly horrifying examples of judges. I mean, this one's going to be difficult to hear, but there's a case of a judge who, someone came before him because he had incested a girl who was 3 years old. And the judge actually blamed the 3-year-old girl and let the guy go, and saying that the little girl, the infant, seduced the man. And to me, that's a reflection that our institutions are actually built on these foundations that are mistaken, and it's partly why it's so difficult but necessary to change this. And I think that's the piece where women are not, they don't exist as subjects. So I was thinking when you were talking, Marie, that if it's a woman standing up for somebody else, which takes a tremendous amount of courage, there's actually more willingness to do that than to do the other piece, which is to stand up for yourself and own your own truth of what happened to you and be the first witness to yourself and to be in solidarity with yourself. And culture does not reward that. I mean, that's not how women are socialized. We're socialized to take care of other people. But I think that the critical piece of solidarity is owning my own truth and accepting it, and it's not based on whether anybody else accepts it, but that I know who I am and what happened to me, and I can hold faith with that.
We have a comment from the audience, which is that, let's see, sorry. It's what's so interesting about campus sexual assault and the perpetrator that you know is it's not that I don't believe her, it's that I don't believe he could possibly have done this, because I know him and rapists don't look like this.
Right. Yeah, and I think that I appreciate the person raising that, because I think that's one of those consistent threads through this book that's very powerful to lift up, is the direct commentary of friends and family members saying none of these guys could have done this because whatever. We know them, they're not like that, and so forth and so on. And that's kind of the whole point of knowing more about rape now that we do is, and one of those experts that was brought into one of the trials was very clear on this, that no, actually this is what a rapist looks like. It's actually, because most sexual assault is acquaintance rape, and it is the person you know and trust and have some connection to that in fact is doing these kinds of things. But I think that's a very important revelation in this discussion that comes up consistently over and over. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'll say this real quickly and then turn it over to Meredith, but I think that what you just said, Marie, is that there's this notion that it's always a stranger that's done it, and their refusal to see that actually rape is a fairly normal part of life. It's a horrible thing to say, and it's not saying that to say that's the way it should be, but the reality is that it is normal. And it makes me think of a philosopher, Laura Brown, who talks about the fact that men who run into buildings and save people or who go off to war are labeled heroes, but survivors of sexual assault are never labeled heroes. And part of the reason is that the hero is defined as somebody who does something outside of the norm. And sexual and domestic violence is the norm.
Yeah, and I want to argue that it's common and accepted as normative, but not normal.
Yes. No, it's entirely not normal.
You know, I want to make an ethical distinction in how we describe it, but still, your point, how common and ordinary it is. Meredith, go ahead.
I don't know if this will be helpful, but whenever you said that rape is normal, I absolutely agreed, but the thought that came to me was that it's also normalized. And
Right,
so
exactly.
because rape is normalized, it's a process, and because it's a process that we're continually buying into through all of these things that we've just been talking about, it's also a process that we can change. So
I think that's a huge distinction. The word, I mean, normalized is really a much more accurate way of describing it, and that gets at the systems and institutions that are part of that normalizing.
Yeah.
Right. And that have been in place for centuries.
Yep.
In terms of the cultural assumptions and acceptance that this is just the way things are. And I think that's a gendered thing growing up, that we are taught that this is just the way things are. But as we like to say at Faith Trust, not the way they have to be.
So Marie, we have a question from the audience, speaking of what's normative. Are young women in college too trusting of men?
Well, let's hear from those of you who interact with young women in college.
I don't know if I would use the language of too trusting of men, but I do recognize and watch this with students that women have a lot of stake in terms of being connected to a man. And so a lot of your status as a woman is very attached to, are you dating somebody? Are you associated with a man? I think that's huge influence. There's a huge amount of social and peer pressure that goes around that. And so it may lead to, you've got 18-year-olds who haven't even learned to listen maybe to their voice, their own inner voice yet, and the cacophony of noise that's coming at them says you aren't worthwhile if you're not attached to a significant other who's male. I don't know, what do you think about that, Meredith?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's interesting. Yeah, I want to say both yes and no. That I think that there are. And it depends on the college student and the context and the sort of sub-context that they find themselves in whenever they get to college. So so I think that a lot of the subcontexts are very much like the subcontext that you're describing, Denise, but there are also some subcontexts at college that are really intent on creating the sort of fostering that sort of inner voice that you're talking about, Denise. And so as a generalization, I think that both yes and no, and that, yeah, it's really important to pay attention to the sort of different subdynamics that are happening on college campuses.
But it doesn't sound like it's still a predominant theme in campus life.
That young women are too trusting of men, or possibly too trusting of men?
Well, and are invested in being male identified and in relationship.
Some are, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's, it sounds like you're saying, Meredith, there's been some change on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it might just be my context, but I'm thinking about a discussion that I had with my freshmen, my first year seminar class last semester, and I was really impressed with the women in that classroom, and in our discussion around sexual violence in worker communities, so sexual violence in like fields, agricultural fields, they were very their voices were very clearly articulated. None of the men in the classroom were talking, and the women were not concerned at all. They were just very sort of, it seemed like very excited to have a space to be able to articulate some of their concerns. and they weren't concerned about what the men in the class thought. And I did think that, Denise, I've seen classrooms like the classroom that you've described, but I was really encouraged by this particular group of women. And so I was trying to think about what sort of dynamics created that. And I do think that there are different subgroups that create different sort of cultural context for women to nurture their own voices or to feel like they need to connect themselves to a man.
I think that's the context is really important, and that, you know, whether you're talking with students that are first generation and what they have been exposed to and the kind of narrative that they've heard at home has a lot to do in terms of how they then come to college, and they know that or they haven't learned that. And so I think context is huge. So yeah, I agree with you. I also think, though, so yeah, I think there's been change. I think there's been progress. But I also, and I don't know how Marie and Meredith feel about this, there are days where I feel like, haven't we been doing this for 40 or 50 years and it feels like we're just starting over again? And one of the articles I have my students read is by the anthropologist Peggy Reeves Sandys. I don't know if you know her work, but she's looked at, are there such things as rape-free cultures? And can you have a rape-free college campus or a rape-prone college campus? And this is what I thought about a lot when I was reading Missoula, is that it comes down often to a zero-tolerance policy. And so if the law enforcement, if the administration and the institution has a no tolerance of that kind of behavior and there's accountability, it takes care of it. And I guess where I get discouraged a little bit is that Missoula is just yet another example of where there is no zero-tolerance policy. There is no enlightenment across the board, in my view. And that's an interesting question, even when we were talking about this book in terms of the institutional response. Is the institutional response oriented towards protection because of the consequences of Title IX, or because it's the right thing to do and people really get it on the kind of gut core level?
Well, I wish it was the second, but it's my experience that it's mostly the first. I think that institutions are scared right now. They're scared after the 2011 Dear Colleague letter that is mentioned in the book, and they're scared because of the number of colleges and universities that rises every day that are under investigation, and the penalties seem to be taken more seriously than they used to be. So I think. And I think that we see that in the way that that a lot of universities are responding, that the focus is on making sure that the institution is, you know, covering all of its bases. We still don't see a lot of increase in like victim care.
Yeah, I would actually say strategically, I have to confess that sometimes when I come at things at my school, I try to find what the area of liability is, because I know if I bring it up in that perspective that they'll listen, and if I brought it up from a different perspective, they're not going to hear it. So it's kind of sad, but that liability piece is the thing sometimes that will get people to listen.
Well, and you know, we've seen the same thing in the church in terms of sexual abuse by clergy. But I think what both of you are pointing to is our understandings of theories of social change, and you know, what strategic points of pressure can be brought to changing the cultural norms of the community that we're living in. Denise, I appreciate you raising that research around the normality of rape. I've always found that fascinating, and that at least her early work that I read was with trying to find a culture in which rape was abnormal. And she cited, my memory is she cited two, one in West Africa and one in indigenous peoples in the Philippines, where in fact, when anthropologists, you know, came in and started asking questions about and described what rape is, and you know, that the people said, what we've never seen that. Why would anybody do that to another person? You know, they had no comprehension because it simply wasn't part of their reality. And I think let me just throw in a little theology at this point, that this is important because it's given being immersed in the discussions that we are about gender-based violence, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that somehow this is part of the creation, that because this is the way things are, the normality that you pointed to. And I think our job in any faith-based setting is to be the folks who stand up and say, no, actually God did not create us victims and victimizers. That is not who we are as God's creation. Therefore, how do we change the culture in which we're living so that this behavior will always be there, but it need not be dominant. It can be peculiar, deviant, odd, occasional, but it's when does this campus or the community say, this is not who we are, and own it in terms of, you know, their response. And I'm not sure that the necessarily, I wouldn't agree, Denise, that the zero tolerance policy is going to get us there, but some way to, and that's why I think it's integrated back into what you all are doing in the classroom, what's happening consistently all the way across that whole community is what's the message that we simply do not do this because we don't believe this is right. And that level of ownership and leadership, I think, is linked with policy and pressure from the outside, is where then we may begin to see some real change. I'm totally willing to use the pressure from the outside, and I think the Title IX efforts and the Department of Justice efforts are very, very important. But until an institution, whether it's the university or the church or whoever, really gets that this is who we say we are, and how do we make it manifest in reality and how we respond to these situations, and whether it's in the athletic program or wherever, it's that kind of leadership that's going to get us to a new normal.
So there's a question from the audience about consent education bystander education as being one way that we share this responsibility. And the other comment is that the rapists are generally male, and this is actually a man's issue, and until men take responsibility for it, we're pretty, as women, as victims, survivors, pretty limited in what we can do.
Okay, Meredith, go.
Okay, so a couple of things. So one, bystander education and sharing the responsibility, I think it's a great idea. I think that it's a limited, that there's limited usefulness to the idea. And in part, I think that there's some limited usefulness to the idea of bystander education because I think it was Denise earlier that was talking about sort of cultural coding, and what I won't try to draw it back to that, but when we talk about bystander education, we're usually not talking about educating people to recognize their own cultural biases in situations that they may or may not intervene in. So for example, we tend to code victims, white victims, for example, more readily than we code black victims. So that's one example of where, so if I'm in a bystander potential intervention scenario and I see a white victim, I'm much more likely to intervene. If bystander intervention were educating about those sorts of cultural dynamics, I think that it would be more effective. But right now, most bystander intervention is not training us to sort of get rid of our cultural baggage. It's just training us to intervene when we see victims, and we have to recognize that we're trained culturally in our coding of victims. So that's my quick thought on bystander education, and I think that consent education has a little more usefulness than bystander education. On the men have to take responsibility thing, I think that's absolutely right, that this is not a gender, it's not a gender problem, this is an everyone problem. But I think that this idea that men have to take responsibility, what a guy said to me once, actually at one of these faculty workshops, he said to me that women can talk about this all day long and not fix the problem because the problem requires the intervention of men. And I think that that this comment betrays an assumption that links women with sort of talk and men with action. And there's an old sort of gender bias that women talk while men do. And so I'm concerned, while I agree that this is not a problem that women can fix by themselves, I'm also a little concerned about this idea that men, that men are going to have to step up, because I think that it's drawing on this sort of old bias that, that men do things while women can just talk about them. And there's a way in which that can manifest rape culture, even in a context where we're attempting to dismantle it. And so there's, I don't know, well, I could go on, but those are my quick thoughts.
I would add, I would agree with your analysis of typical bystander education and intervention as just not being robust enough. The one place where I do see it helpful in the classroom is I spend a lot of time with students talking about how once they have this knowledge, how do they actually live it out? And what do they do when they're in the context where slut shaming is happening, or where any number of sexist or racist kinds of things? What kind of person are they in that context? And so we actually talk through what their responses can be, which I consider to be a different kind of bystander intervention that establishes a different norm with their friends, and so they don't sit there and feel like I just have to be silent. I can't say anything because I'll get shouted down. So I agree with you on the larger piece of it, that it's just not robust enough.
But I agree that there are forms of it that are more robust than others, certainly.
I would also, the other piece of that, I remember living in Chicago, and there was a well-off neighborhood where sexual assaults were happening. And first of all, people were shocked that they were happening in well-off neighborhoods, which just shows that you don't know what you're talking about. But second of all, the police would always gather all the women together and say, here's how to take care of yourself. And there was never a meeting called for men.
Right.
Where's the meeting for men called to, like, okay, stop raping?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I love that Krakauer started his first chapter with a quote from Jessica Valenti.
Yep.
Women don't get raped because they were drinking or took drugs. Women do not get raped because they weren't careful enough. Women get raped because someone raped them. And it's the someone who raped them piece of our attention that, again, in the book, I think we see consistently is removed, and carefully removed from any responsibility for this reality. But the bystander education part that I like, and that I think has a lot of potential, in addition to intervening when you see something and hear something, but it also takes us back to the solidarity issue of the bystander looking out for one's peers and friends. And I think it sounds to me like the stuff I'm reading online and hearing people talk about, there's much more of that going on than ever there was when I was an undergraduate, that intentionally, making sure that people know where people are, and using phones and social media to keep up with each other, to call me if you need help and that kind of thing. And I think that's a positive, just tactical thing, particularly for women to be able to do in terms of the role of the bystander. So I think it's some of all of that. And certainly the consent education, I'm really fascinated by. And the recent article a week ago in the New York Times that I think is referenced on our resource list, I would encourage people to look at, because it kind of summarizes some of the consent education that's going on a number of campuses, which again brings us back to where each of you are working, is in the classroom, so that the discussion is being brought into the whole reason people are in college, which is hopefully to learn something. But this is a very particular thing that they clearly need to learn something about. One of the comments, I don't know if I can find it right off, but this quite struck me, was about the consent issue. It's actually out of this article. Let me see if I can. That when consent is brought up in a male group, like by an educator, that the men in the group don't seem to know what you're talking about. Oh, here it is. In my experience, when you ask men on college campuses where they learned about consent, they sort of look at you blankly and say, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" You know, but let's talk about that for a minute, because we're running out of time here, but I want to get to the question of the thing that really struck me in the book as we heard the voices of the perpetrators was what they thought they were doing and where they learned whatever they thought they were doing, and both in terms of their view of women, but also sexually, that one talked about that in watching pornography, this is what women liked, and that is what he was trying to do, and he didn't understand why she didn't like it, and why it was rape. I mean, but I mean, literally, I think we've got to go way back to a discussion of sexuality and sex education that appears to be part of the gap, not all of it, but part of the gap that's creating some of these situations. What do you think?
I think there's a huge theological and religious institutional piece of what you just talked about, and it's one of the things when I engage in conversation with a lot of my undergraduates, that they somehow or another have walked out of a lot of their religious education with too literal a sense of this is just about the do's and the don'ts, and that religion is about obedience and about rules, and it's not. They don't walk away with what I think we would hope they'd walk away with, which is a robust understanding of what a whole person means and what dignity means, and what does it mean to have other regard and to not be governed only by self-interest. I just finished a class of teaching two sections of contemporary moral issues, and I hoped by the end of the semester I could peel them off of self-interest as being ethical, and it's very difficult in the culture that we live in. And I think that's driving a lot of this behavior. It doesn't justify it, but it's more, we live in a culture of instant gratification. I can have what I want. What's wrong with that?
And I'm entitled to it if I'm part of the dominant,
That's right. That's right.
Team.
Yeah.
So.
And then the other piece of that is, what have I learned from the male side? What have I learned about what makes me a real man? I mean, that's why I include in every women in religion class, I include sections on masculinity. And we talk about that with the guys. What have you taught? What have you been taught in the locker room? What have you been taught, and how is gender disciplined? How have you been on the receiving end of that? And trying to bring it out into the open so that they become capable of analyzing their own experiences of that. And that's what gives me a lot of hope when I've had those conversations with men. I mean, one guy this semester who talked about being shamed because he came out onto a rugby field wearing biker shorts, and he was told they were gay and sent back to the locker room. But even having a place where the guys can talk about that and know they're not going to be ridiculed, and it's going to be part of the problem that women are facing too in terms of how they are being disciplined to obey their quote-unquote gender rules.
Exactly. Meredith, you want to get in on the sex ed problem?
Yeah, well, I think it's a problem of I guess, well, a sort of consciousness raising about gender roles and sex education problem. And so early and often, sex education and education about gender roles. Much earlier than we do. We don't usually get to those things until college anymore, which is really well, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a terrible reality, and I think that there's some tension here, and I don't know. Maybe it would be interesting for you to talk about this briefly, Marie, or maybe Denise. But the role of religious communities and the role that they have played and continue to play in affecting access to sex education in things like advocating for abstinence-only education. And so how to deal with that then, yeah, how to deal with that history and then working with religious communities and considering the role that maybe in this context that religious communities might play in sex education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's part of what Denise is pointing to in terms of the inadequacy at best of our sex education efforts in church. And as far as I'm concerned, and this is one of my soapboxes around youth ministry and working with young adults in faith communities, is this should be a #1 priority as far as I'm concerned to what we should be offering to young people, as they have a place where they're both getting education and accurate information about sexuality, but also a place where they can deal with their questions, their concerns, their confusion, their experiences of abuse that they're bringing into that whole discussion, that we should be that place. And hopefully, you know, there's an educational setting that can reflect that as well. But I think it should be a #1 priority for the faith community. It should be a safe place to do that. And it disturbs me when I hear people talking about what's happening in a lot of youth ministry at this point that is not addressing our kids' experiences, for one thing. There are some exceptions to that, and I think we need to lift those up. And in my denomination, United Church of Christ, in concert with Unitarian Universalists, the sex ed materials that they developed in the last 20 years and are implementing pretty consistently are first rate in terms of bringing that fuller discussion and so forth and so on, and creating a place where the conversation can go on. And I know other denominations are making efforts at that as well, and other faith movements, but not nearly enough, because it's inexcusable that our kids are not getting that kind of preparation. And I think then, you know, Missoula is part of the consequence of that. It's, again, not the whole story, but it's part of the consequence of confusion and on the part of men and women as to their exploration of their sexuality and what's expected and how to interpret their experiences and so forth and so on. And the assumptions that many men seem to have of entitlement to sexual access to women without consent, without consequence. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop. And I guess one of the questions I have, as this is our first effort at this, is, and I want to ask those of you who are joining us for this, is this seems to me like not enough time to really, we've got one whole other section we wanted to talk about in terms of the accountability and interventions efforts within the university. So my question, if you would give us feedback on, is would you be interested in this being an hour-and-a-half slot that we would do in the future in terms of talking about a particular book? Because the thing about focusing on one book is there's so much there to talk about that we simply haven't had enough time, I don't think, to do it justice. So that's my question to those of you who are with us. Are there any other pressing issues, Sarah, from from our listeners and participants that we need to address?
No, actually, you got to most of them. So good job. Well
Okay.
done.
I am sorry that we're not able to talk more about the complexities of university discipline procedures versus legal procedures and so forth, but I will conclude with from Krakauer's comments in conclusion, and I think he does an excellent job in his last chapter of sort of bringing us to this is what we have to learn from this situation. But I'll quote him briefly in this regard. Despite the deeply flawed ways that many universities investigate and adjudicate rape allegations, it's important that they not be allowed to abdicate their institutional responsibility and simply turn over sexual assault cases to law enforcement agencies. Criminal investigations of students accused of rape should be undertaken in addition to university disciplinary procedures, not in lieu of them. The criminal justice system simply moves too slowly and is constrained by too many formidable procedural obstacles, as Judge Posner put it, to reliably punish campus rapists and remove them from the academic community. Expelling a rapist isn't an ideal outcome because the offender remains on the loose, free to rape elsewhere. Expulsion is far better than no punishment at all, however. At least it spares the victim from having to live and study in close proximity to her assailant. So I think that whole question of how do we handle this and what's the intervention in terms of the university's responsibility and criminal justice system's responsibility is the challenge of that Krakauer leaves us with, and that many universities are now struggling with, and the Department of Justice is pushing in terms of trying to bring clarity to that. So I thank you both for your time and your participation. This has been a really interesting conversation, I think. And hopefully we will invite you again for another book that we read. And we want suggestions for books for our book club. So anyone who is reading something that you think we would all be interested in talking about, please let Sarah know, and we'll certainly consider it. Our next book is, and Sarah's going to give you the detail on this, there it is, Uncovered by Leah Lax. How I Left Hasidic Life and Finally Came Home is the subtitle. And I found this a fascinating discussion by the author of her experience of living most of her adult life and as a Hasidic Jew in that community, and later in her life coming to a new understanding of herself and all that entailed in terms of the particular experience of the community and her family. So that's next on our list for March 2nd. Please join us, and I'll pass it back now to Sarah for final comments.
Okay, thanks, Marie. And just to let everyone know, Uncovered is not a story of domestic or sexual violence. So if this was a tough book for you, Uncovered may be a little bit of an easier read. It's a fascinating book. I'm going to close up the webinar here. If you would just take a moment and please fill out the survey. We really would love your feedback about whether the technology worked, if you had enough opportunity to interact, if you have suggestions for other technology that might work more effectively, and also what books you think we should read. So this concludes our presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.